We're only a few hours from kickoff. Huge game between the Seahawks and Jets. Playoff elimination, both teams being 7-8. Before we get to kickoff, going to be answering your questions in a bonus Q&A episode of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. A special thanks to all the 12s out there only a few hours before kickoff at Lumen Field for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 6 days a week. And in this instance, it might be 7 episodes. We're going to have a postcast coming up later today. As always, we appreciate your support listening to the podcast. As you can see, I'm actually not at Lumen Field. I was supposed to be covering the game, and then my health decided to step in and say, you're going to stay at home. So I'm stuck here covering remotely once again. I am feeling great, but unfortunately did not want to put other people at risk. So I am here doing a bonus Q&A, going to be answering as many questions as possible here, leading up to a huge game between the Seahawks and the Jets. Both teams 7-8. Looking to get back to 500 and stay in a playoff race. This is truly a playoff elimination game. The Seahawks mathematically could still be alive if they lose this game, but they're going to need pretty much every other game with other wildcard contenders to go their way. And even then, it would be less than a 5% chance that they would make the postseason going into the season finale. So this is a huge game. Jets are in a very similar position. So I'm going to be answering as many questions as I can from you, our valued listeners. Got a bunch of questions off Twitter. If you're listening on YouTube, feel free to post a question in the comments section. And if there's an opportunity for me to answer a few questions live off of YouTube, I will do that as well. This bonus episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's week 17 of the 2022 season. I'm banking on a big 3-touchdown night from Kirk Cousins against the Packers. That might seem like a bold leap, especially at Lambeau Field. But with Prize Picks, it's easy to play daily fantasy and put those entries to the test. Pick 2 to 5 players. If they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections in any sport that you watch, including the NFL, NBA, MLB, and boxing. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy with safe and fast withdrawals. It's currently operational in over 30 states as well as Canada. So go download the Prize Picks app today or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100. Promo code if dollars. They'll give you $100. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. All right, let's get to our questions here on our bonus Q&A. Again, tons of questions coming in on Twitter before the show, but if you are listening live and you want to submit a question in the comments section, I will gladly look over there as we progress through this Q&A, and I'll answer some questions live that way as well. So let's get to it. Our first question here coming from Luke at Cold Ones on Twitter. Seattle has to go defense with their 2 very high first-round picks, correct? I don't know that that's necessarily true, although I would be leaning that direction with what we've seen this season from the Seahawks. It feels like there are more long-term pieces on the offensive side of the football right now. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are both going to be back next season. Noah Fant, they picked up the 5th-year option. Will Dissly's under contract. Colby Parkinson will be in the final year of his rookie deal, so they're going to have all their tight ends. You've got 2 bookends of the tackle positions that you think are the future there that have had really solid rookie seasons. Those guys could be your tackles for the next 10 years. So they have a lot of foundational pieces. The interior offensive line, there's some question marks there. I just don't know that the Seahawks would be going center or guard with one of those really high draft picks. There are some good centers in this draft, but I don't see the Seahawks using their 3rd or right now 12th draft pick on a center, even though that's a huge position of need, in my opinion. I think you've got to go for the high-value positions on defense, and there's some really good players at the top of this draft. Got to see a couple of them play yesterday in bowl games, in Jalen Carter with the Georgia Bulldogs, as well as Will Anderson with the Alabama Crimson Tide. And so there are some really good defensive tackles that can be game wreckers. edge rushers. Seattle certainly needs a partner to go with Uchenna Nwosu. Maybe Boye Mafe can become that guy too. The Seahawks just need to see what he's capable of by playing him more. Hopefully Pete Carroll will back up his words and that will happen. But they need help in the interior defensive line, and they need help rushing the quarterback off the edge. And this is a draft that's got plenty of talent at those two positions. There's some really elite talent at the top of this draft too. So I would think that that's where the Seahawks would be leaning. And obviously if they want to go quarterback, if they're in love with one of the QBs at the top of this draft, then that changes things as well. So I don't know that they have to go defense with both these picks, but I would be leaning that direction based on where things stand right now with this football team, the struggles they've had defending the run, being near the bottom of the league in pass rush win rate. They got a lot of issues on defense. They need to get some cornerstones on that side of the ball, whereas offense, it feels like they do have quite a few of those cornerstones already. Defense, they need those pillars, and this is a good draft to make that happen with that great draft capital they got coming from the Denver Broncos. Jared tweets, what do you think it will take Seattle to get that spark back they had when they won 3 or 4 games in a row? How do they all of a sudden hit a wall at the most important time of the season? Jared, I think this is really an example of a perfect storm. You had a lot of different things come together. For one thing, I think you look back at the teams that they beat during that stretch when they won 4 games in a row. The win over the New York Giants, you were fortunate to get 2 turnovers on special teams that you cashed in and got 10 points on. And that really was what ultimately won the football game for them. So that was a game they caught some breaks. They beat the Cardinals twice without Rodney Hudson at center. That was a huge loss for their offensive line. So they couldn't run the ball. They couldn't protect Kyler Murray. Murray was making a lot of mistakes on his own. Cardinals haven't been very good this year anyway. So you had 2 wins against a team that has been eliminated from the playoffs for a few weeks now. So I think the opponents they were playing maybe masked the deficiencies on defense rather than them truly improving their run defense and getting better, getting after the quarterback. And once they got through that stretch of games, and even teams like the Raiders that didn't have good records had more talent than their record suggested, and they were able to take advantage of the Seahawks. So I think that the competition they played during that span bloated their record a little bit. They've had some injuries. The offense has hit the skids a little bit with the run game not being there, the offensive line regressing. And I think the rookie wall is something that we have to consider here. Seattle is playing so many rookies, a significant amount of snaps, including their 2 tackles, that it's been very noticeable here the last 4 or 5 weeks, where it just seems like those rookies haven't been able to quite get over that hump and get back to playing the way they did in the first half of the season. And so I think you put all those elements together, and the fact that this team was playing with house money, I don't think that they're as bad as what their record suggests the last 6 games. They've been competitive in those games, and they've had chances to win several of those games and couldn't get it done. But I also think that the 6-3 record now, looking back on it, that it's been proven that they weren't as good as that record illustrated either. They've had a lot of issues with teams that are talented football teams, and they were able to feast on some teams that clearly are not going to the postseason in the middle of the year. And the Chargers, the only team that maybe is going to the playoffs they beat during that stretch, maybe the Giants as well, obviously. But the Giants, to me, that's not a great team. The coaching job has been impressive. But the Chargers, that's the one win on there. The Chargers were missing several key players on offense. So it's tough to look at that game and say the Seahawks didn't luck out a little bit with the opponent being banged up in that game too. So really, it's a perfect storm for the Seahawks. And all this stuff coming together has made it difficult for them to get back into the win column here against, quite frankly, better opponents as of late. Teams have been playing better, like the Carolina Panthers. So it's been a perfect storm for them. Casey Masterman, what do you think is a reasonable offer for the Seahawks to make to Geno Smith? And then he says 3 years, $80 million-ish. I would be surprised if they're able to get him that cheap with the production he's had being a Pro Bowler. And I know there are some listeners that will say, well, the last few weeks he hasn't been as good. Yes, he's been pressing more. He's been throwing the football in tight coverage, making some questionable decisions. But the offensive line play, as I just mentioned in the last question, I think that's been such a big part of the regression of this football team as a whole. The offensive line struggling to open up run lanes. Pass protection has not been near as good across the board, in the interior especially. And that's made life really tough on Geno. And yet the numbers still are top 5 in most categories. He's been one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. There's a reason that he was picked for the Pro Bowl, and he's had a fantastic season. There are going to be other teams that are going to be willing to pay good money if he hits the free agent market. I'm still thinking $30 million per year if we're looking at that 2 to 3 year contract. I don't know if the Seahawks are looking at him as the guy that's going to be under center the next 2 or 3 years. but you're going to have to give him that type of contract. And unless there's a quarterback you absolutely fall in love with in this draft class, I mean, you could still take a QB, but that rookie quarterback contract is so valuable. You want to have that player on the field if you're going to invest one of those high picks into a quarterback. And so if they're in that position, I don't think you want to pay that kind of money. But if you're not going to be drafting a quarterback early and you're going to be trying to address the needs on defense, then yeah, I'm thinking that 30 million range is still probably where you're going to be at to pay Geno Smith, a little less than what the franchise tag value is. But that's what you're looking at for a 2-3-year contract. All right, next question here. Dollar Store Pete Carroll. Do you feel the Seahawks take a huge haul and trade down their top 3 pick, or are you more convinced they trade down their second pick of the first round? I worry about them reverting back to past bad draft habits and not taking the best player available. They have plenty to address. So you can look at this from two sides of the coin here. If you're somebody that's like, hey, we can trade down, maybe we can get a first-round pick for next year. Maybe we're more excited about next year's class. That's maybe when you go get your quarterback. Then you could trade down a few picks. And when you have a top 3 selection, you can get a king's ransom for that, especially if a team like the Panthers wants to trade up to get a quarterback. You can make that type of a move. On the flip side, though, this is a chance that the Seahawks have not had for a long, long time to get an elite blue chip player, whether that's Jalen Carter or Will Anderson, or if they want to draft somebody like a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. They have not been in position to make that type of a pick. They had a top 10 pick last year, but not a top 5 selection where you can get one of the cream of the crop elite talents in the draft class. And so it really just depends what the Seahawks viewpoint is. If they don't view Jalen Carter or Will Anderson as that top 3 pick worthy cornerstone, and they think they can trade down and get somebody else that's going to be able to make an immediate impact, and they can recoup a couple more picks to continue adding talent to this roster, then yeah, it makes sense. But if there's a quarterback that you absolutely fall in love with, you take that quarterback there. Or if you think Jalen Carter or Will Anderson or one of these other top players in that top 5 range is worth that selection and can be an immediate star for you on defense, then you've got to make that selection. So that's really what John Schneider is going to have to think about there. And of course, that 12th pick or wherever they end up picking with the second selection, their native pick, wherever that falls, that's still going to have value trading down, but it's not going to be like that number 3 pick. Like I said, you can get future first-round picks for that if teams want to move up to get a quarterback, depending how many picks they're trading up for. And so it gives John Schneider a lot of leverage, but you also have that elite talent there that you're going to want to try to draft. Yair tweets, are you still rooting for the team to make the playoffs? Do you think it's substantially better to lose out for draft capital and future? I'm just going to say this right now. As a reporter, I'm not rooting for anything from the Seahawks, but I can tell you this right now. There isn't a right or wrong answer to this question, because think about it. If the Seahawks make the playoffs, is that a bad thing? No, it's not. Your rookie class, this heralded 2020 rookie class, is going to get invaluable experience playing in a postseason game on the road. That is a big deal going into 2023. It's a chance to continue evaluating Geno Smith. I mean, what if Geno Smith goes into Minnesota and beats Kirk Cousins and you get that big playoff win? Now, he's thinking that's more money for me, but it really solidifies your viewpoint. Hey, we can do damage with Geno Smith as quarterback, and we can really stock the roster around him next year with the draft picks that we have. And if he goes out and has a dud of a performance and you get blown out in the wild card round, hey, you still made the playoffs. It gave you a chance to evaluate. So I don't think making the postseason is a bad thing. Obviously, it has a major impact on your draft position. If you make the playoffs, that second pick is now in the low 20s, but still, there's a lot of benefits to that, making the postseason with a young roster for the future. And at the same time, if you lose out your last 2 games, there's a good chance you have a top 10 pick now. When you're looking at a record of 7-10, you could have a top 10 pick. So you could be picking 2nd or 3rd overall from the Broncos and have another top 10 pick. And that gives you a real good chance to get 2 premium players from this draft class. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. And some fans are going to say that they want those 2 top 10 picks. Some are going to say they want to make the playoffs and see if they can win a wild card game. Either way, I don't see it being a bad thing for this franchise. They're in a position where either outcome is not necessarily a bad thing. JRB, the Seahawks need to draft a center, but how valuable would it be to say it is to re-sign Austin Blythe as a backup? So this would be my viewpoint on this because of Austin Blythe's experience in this system, playing for Shane Waldron and Andy Dickerson. I think getting him back on a one-year deal where you have him competing against a rookie that you bring in, that's a win-win for the Seahawks, because if you have Austin Blythe on the roster, a guy that has started a lot of games in the NFL, and you have him there to put pressure on your incoming rookie, that's good. It's good to have that type of competition, and you're hoping that your incoming rookie ends up being the better player and wins the job outright. If not, then it gives you time to develop that player and eventually usurp him in the starting lineup. So I think it could make sense as long as Austin Blythe was coming in understanding that, hey, we're signing you back to a one-year contract. You are not guaranteed the starting job. And you wouldn't have to say that signing him. You can draft a center then in April after you re-sign him. I think it would be a win-win for the team if they decided to do that. I think as a backup, he'd be a really solid backup with all the starting experience that he has at center. But that is clearly a position that they need to consider upgrades. And they've had opportunities to do that last couple of years, and they haven't gotten it done. This is a very solid center class coming in for the 2022 NFL draft. Several players that I think could go late first to late second range. There could be 2, 3, 4 centers that fall in that line. So Seattle's going to have an opportunity to get one of those players, but I could see some value in having Austin Blythe back as the backup, as a really good depth piece that has a lot of experience starting in the NFL. And a question coming here from, this one's blocked off here. Fletch, starting QB next year for the Seahawks is ... Well, as I just mentioned, I think it's probably going to be Geno Smith based on where things stand right now. I don't see the Seahawks going into the draft without a veteran quarterback on the roster. Now, who knows? If John Schneider really thinks that C.J. Stroud is the next big thing in Seattle and he thinks he's got a chance to get him with the number 3 overall pick, or Bryce Young, if somehow the Texans don't pick him first overall and they go with Stroud instead, if one of those quarterbacks is there and they fall in love with them, then that changes things, because I would think that you would want, if you're using a top 3 quarterback or top 3 pick on a quarterback, you are going to want that kid to play right away. Again, the value of that rookie contract, you want to get that player out there and build around that rookie. And then you wouldn't have all that money invested in Geno Smith. At the same time, if they're not sold on one of those players and they're not wanting to draft a QB early, then yes, Geno Smith is a much better option than the other free agents that are going to be out there, most likely. So you're going to have to spend a premium for that anyway. So I think Geno Smith right now, I'd be leaning 75, 80% right now that he's going to be the starter, with the other 20% being if there is a quarterback they really like that they could pick 3rd overall or wherever they end up picking with that Broncos pick, they could go that route and choose to move on from Geno Smith, despite the fact he made the Pro Bowl this year. I expect that he's going to be back next season, though. All right, looking over here for our YouTube questions here. See if there's any interesting ones here. Tupug Shakur, can we get Jimmy G or Derek Carr for similar price as Geno, and do they fit Pete Carroll's? Well, thank you. Appreciate it. This is a question that has been asked a few times this week of me, and I haven't had a chance to answer it yet with the holidays, but I don't know why you would go that route, because, I mean, if Derek Carr gets released by the Raiders, which that may happen because they have a very time-sensitive situation where they would have to cut him before he has a guaranteed bonus that kicks in. And then obviously they do not want that to happen, or they wouldn't have benched him for these last 2 games to avoid an injury. They want to make sure he's healthy so he passes physical and they don't have to worry about paying that premium. But I just don't know that he's any better than what Geno has been this year. Now, if you think that Geno's one season, it's a one-off, and you think Derek Carr is going to be able to come in with the receivers that you have and put up better numbers, then of course you could go that route. Jimmy Garoppolo, I would say at this point that's completely out of the question. Geno Smith has better numbers across the board this year. Jimmy Garoppolo's got the lengthy injury history. I think there will be teams that are interested in him in free agency, but I don't see the Seahawks being that team. Carr, maybe you could say there's a 5% chance if he hits the mark as a free agent, and you could maybe, put those receivers out there and say, hey, look, this is an ideal landing spot for you. But I think the Jets is probably where Derek Carr is going to end up. Speaking of the Jets, that's where I think he's going to end up. I just think at this point, with the money that you're going to be paying, it makes more sense to keep Geno Smith, who knows the system, has played really well in this system. I think Derek Carr could run the system fine. I think Jimmy Garoppolo could run the system fine. I just don't think that that's an upgrade. And with the money that you're going to be paying, I don't think it makes any sense to go that route, quite frankly. I think Geno Smith would be the better option of those three. Just stay in-house if you're not going to be drafting a quarterback in the top 5. And you could still keep Geno in that case too. But I do think that that adds a little bit of an element of trickiness there for the Seahawks, because if you're investing a pick that high in a quarterback, you want them playing early. If you've got Geno Smith on the bench with a 3-year, $90 million contract, that is not necessarily ideal. So they're going to have to navigate all of that stuff right now. But there's certainly conversations going on in the front office trying to figure out what they're going to do at the quarterback position. And we got another question here that is coming in from Jamal's Burner. Oh, interesting. Who would you like the Seahawks to pick with their top draft pick? So who would I like them to pick right now? It's still way too early in the process for me to say that there's a favorite for that selection. I didn't think that Jalen Carter had a great game yesterday for Georgia. That was not the player that I've watched most of this season that takes over games in the game record, but he would probably still be atop my list, even with that one game yesterday. I've seen enough on film to suggest that this is a transcendent talent that can take over games in the interior. Seattle desperately needs a defensive tackle. They can play that 3-tech, 4-eye role that can dominate games. They've had to deal with other teams having those type of players over the years, but they haven't had that guy. Jalen Carter can be that player for them, and Will Anderson would probably be choice number 2, a dynamic player off the edge that can do a lot of different things, has dominated at Alabama. So those 2 players, we keep hearing their names out there, but they're atop my list right now. If you're looking to go quarterback right now, Bryce Young would be slightly ahead of CJ Stroud on my list. Stroud played really well yesterday, though. That was a hell of a performance against a really good Georgia defense. So maybe he's a player that ends up vaulting Bryce Young to the number 1 quarterback spot. But I think those 2 are head and shoulders above all the other quarterbacks. Will Levis is certainly one that has the physical tools. I haven't seen anything on film, though, that suggests to me to this point that he's ready to jump in and be a starter. I would be scared to use a top 10 pick on him. But those other 2 quarterbacks would be ones that maybe would be up for consideration if that's the direction you want to go. But I'm thinking defense right now. Jalen Carter, Will Anderson in that top 3 range would be 2 players I think can immediately come in and be impact players for you on defense and potentially be Pro Bowl or All-Pro caliber talent that you get with those top selections. Off of YouTube, Yanni, who or what position would you target in free agency? So a lot of this has to do with what your viewpoint is on the draft as a front office. And this is all stuff that's going on behind the scenes. But I look at this free agent class that's coming up, and maybe you could get some interior offensive line help in free agency rather than using draft picks to address that. Maybe you can get another receiver, although I am really of the belief you would want to draft receivers instead. Not necessarily first round. There are some really good players that are going to be available, though. But, they could always go that route. Marquise Goodwin has had a solid season for them before going on injured reserve, and they got him late in the process. So I really think that you got to be looking free agency. They don't have as much cap space, I think, as some people are under the belief that they have, especially if they're going to re-sign Geno Smith. That really changes things. If Geno Smith's getting a 3-year, $90 million contract, it's going to give you a lot less flexibility to go out and make a splashy signing in free agency. And that hasn't necessarily been John Schneider's MO anyway. But you want to look for players like Uchenna Nwosu that you can get good value for, that are still in their mid-20s, have room to still improve, rather than players that are late 20s, early 30s that are probably peaked and heading towards getting diminishing returns as declining players. And we've seen the Seahawks do that too much over the years. So that's really the focal point for me, rather than position. Certain types of players. Can I get players that are in the prime of their career, mid-20s, that still have room to grow, that fit my scheme well? And then I can use those free agent signings to then determine what I'm going to be doing in the draft. And so it's really a process. A lot of people mention when they talk free agency, well, what we do in the draft, obviously that's being discussed behind the scenes, but free agency choices dictate what you end up doing come draft time. So it's kind of a reverse of what the narrative is that is out there. But as far as positions go, free agency is one of those things. You got to see which guys don't get franchise tagged. And then once you get to that point, you can have an idea what players are out there. But if Geno's re-signed, they're not going to have a lot of money to throw around anyway in free agency. So that's something to consider. Anyway, 12s, greatly appreciate the chance to answer your questions here on a bonus Q&A. We've got kickoff coming up in a few hours at Lumen Field. Seahawks and Jets, both teams 7-8. Looking for a key victory to stay in the playoff race. This truly is a playoff elimination game happening with 2 weeks left to play. The Seahawks badly need this one. So do the Jets. A lot at stake as both teams look to keep their playoff hopes alive. Thanks for listening in. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. We will have a postcast coming up today on Locked On Seahawks after the game. As always, dishing out my game balls, 3 up, 3 down, and some key storylines coming out of the game. And hopefully we'll be chatting about a Seahawks victory. That'll be coming a few hours after the final play in Seattle. Hope you'll be listening in. Thanks for your questions. Go Hawks.